A massive charging ship washes ashore in New Jersey on September 14. Additionally, it was so severely damaged that it was even easy to recognize. A few hours later, once the corpses had been thoroughly investigated, locals began to pull human bodies out of the sea. They turned out to be the final travelers aboard Morro Castle, the most advanced ship at the time. As it turns out, the Titanic sinking wasn't the most terrifying maritime catastrophe in history. Who is to blame for one of the worst shipwrecks in history, if not the largest one? The actual innovation, in the opinion of developers, was a piece of legislation that measured 155 meters, or almost half of the Eiffel Tower. The Morro Castle wasn't the biggest soul of the early 20th century, but it was small enough to travel at an astonishing speed of up to. With a top speed of 37 kilometers per hour, this ship was able to travel from New York to Havana in just 2 days, an absolute record for the time. Aside from that, the Miner was outfitted with cutting-edge technology, including a gyro compass that informed the crew of their exact direction of movement. Regular college campuses it performed flawlessly. Problems were mainly caused by unstable magnetic fields. There were also echoes and hearing equipment capable of correctly determining the DEP under Morro Castle, and it was one of the first ships to obtain it, but even these advantages weren't enough to keep the ship from going off the rails. Duty, or could they have actually been responsible for the fact that 500 Americans were returning from Havana on the last voyage of the Morro Castle on September 5, 1932, ecstatic that they could break the prohibition law and consume alcohol on board during the Great Depression. But something went wrong with the trim after only 1.5 days. Captain Robert Wilmette abruptly reported experiencing stomach discomfort. The crew chose not to turn the ship around at that moment because New York, the intended destination, was extremely nearby. Instead, they transported Wilmot to the closest hospital later that evening. Often found dead in his cabin. It immediately seemed suspicious to some crew members because Wilmot had never had any health issues before. Was it likely that someone helped him get sick and die? But anyway, there was no time to play detective in command of the ship. There was still a problem, though he had never previously seen the equipment that Morro Castle was stuffing with, and as the officer was trying to urgently become tech-savvy, a new threat was quickly approaching the liner and guard spot in an oncoming storm that was tempted to slow the ship down. He tried to fire according to safety requirements, but he failed. Morro Castle was charging headlong towards the surging waters. It's possible that the worms and their capacity to run new ingenious technologies were the primary reasons of the horrific shipwreck. What's unexpected is that they've already had a disastrous outcome. Years prior to that, a paddle steamer called Architect drowned in the chilly seas of the North Atlantic Ocean on September 27th, the 27th, the 18th, and the 50th. That was only possible because the crew was overconfident. The terrified builders have been following your gold in order to create the fastest liner that ever existed before that horrible accident. Brand new steam engines, which were impressive at the time and drove pedal wheels on both sides of the ship to propel it through the water, allowed our speed to reach 23 km per hour, which in turn led it to cover the distance between the UK and U. That Aunt Dick had in fact achieved their goals. Works in only 9.5 days rather than the usual multiple weeks. But the designers took care to make the steamer a very pleasant and enjoyable place to be as well. Due to this, the ship had a significant increase in popularity in September of 1854, on the 13th. And it welcomed 400 passengers aboard, and only a tenth of them got lucky enough to return to dry land. The steamer's route went through the Grand Banks of the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Canada, where the warm waters of the Gulf Stream meet with cold air from the north. That's why this area is usually covered in dense fog. Usually, sailors take extreme caution when going through this section of the route. Except for the crew of the Arctic captain, James Luce didn't even order the speed to be reduced. He only told the lookouts to stay alert. This was sound advice, so they noticed the silhouette of another vessel shrouded in fog. They immediately informed the team, but it was too late to move at top speed. Alternatively, they smashed with the ship Vesta, which was carrying French fishermen. Jam is full of advances, but it's still made of wood, right? The heavy French ship was constructed of steel. Even if the iron bow wouldn't have been like a battering ram if it had been rammed into our dicks. I didn't perplex the carefree crew, and he didn't undermine their sense of superiority. In addition, that dangerous steel bow just slipped off after the accident. The crew promised the passengers that the ship wouldn't sink because it was larger than its rival and had several inner compartments. But, in the meantime, the small French ship, which had been well designed to keep afloat, was gradually sinking. The problem was that its inner compartments were built of wood, and the damage was so serious that the planks couldn't keep the sea water from flowing inside. Is it because the steamboat was doomed or because the deck only had 6 lifeboats? They could only fit 180 people on board, less than half of all the sailors and passengers, and the squad failed to save even this number of people. The boats were launched carelessly and were typically stolen. Male staff members may completely take control since, unlike passengers, they know where to escape and panic well. Men were trying their hardest to get onto one of the boats, and all of the women and children died in the icy water on that cruise. Only 61 individuals survived the shipwreck, and only the skipper survived. Stood on a large wooden box with the passengers till the finish. While salt water was pouring into the ship, he attempted to calm the panicked crew. Perhaps this is why fate took pity on him after the ship sank. He cleaned up the wooden box and bobbed to the surface. Only took him far away from the site, and the captain spent too many days in the cold ocean until a passing ship rescued him. His little son, 11-year-old Willie, lost his stay on our deck and died together with the other passengers remaining on board. 80 years later, advanced technologies failed Chief Officer Worm's tool, but even despite his frustrating incompetence, Moral Castle still had a chance to stay afloat, and it probably would have managed to do it if the crew hadn't faced another problem. The newly appointed skipper was fighting the storm about 3 a.m. Visitors to the first-class smoky room noted that smoke had reached an alarming level. The vapors were caused by a fire that had broken out in the Moral Fortress. Weren't rushing in at breakneck speed, all because the shipbuilders prioritized maximum luxury and comfort over everything else, including passenger safety. The interior of the liner was crammed with surrounding furnishings, and its deck was coated in flammable oil-based paint, making it the ideal energy source. Fire your most pathetic incompetence. A group of sailors were unable to put out such a large fire, and the crew of the ship continued to report that the catastrophe occurred about 10:30 p.m. on December 27, 1987, off the coast of the Philippines. The majority of the travelers were present. The captain left his post, made himself comfortable in his cabin, cracked open a bottle of beer, and began watching his favorite show. In the meantime, an oil tanker was rapidly approaching, carrying more than 1,000 people. The captain reasoned that he could sit down and she would have been too. Tons of gasoline and other petroleum products. Nobody even noticed its approach. Shortly after that, the two ships collided. The blow was so strong that it resulted in an explosion, setting the deck on fire. Within moments, the flames reached the ferry's command center in no time. This resulted in a total power outage. Terrified passengers were desperately searching for life jackets, but none of them were successful for one simple reason: there were none. Board members jumped from the flaming ship into the water, where they were instantly harmed due to the state of the waters around them. A puddle of hot oil. In such conditions, there was little hope of survival, but even the most fortunate persons were left alone and without assistance because coastal services only learnt about the accident a day later. Only 20 people were among the almost 4,400 passengers. 6 people miraculously survived. The captain of the ship died, never leaving his cabin. Sometime later, the National Geographic dump of the event will be Asia's Titanic. If we compare the number of victims, the shipwreck of Don't Have Pause claimed nearly 3 times more lives than the most famous tragedy in history. However, if the reason behind it was quite clear, a crash where the Tinker was transporting highly flammable substances, it's still unknown what actually caused the Moral Castle fire, and even when it occurred, Chief Officer Worms did have a slim chance to save the ship. When the fire broke, CAF was only 40 minutes away from the port of New Jersey. If Worms had done the liner there, he wouldn't have probably saved all those people's lives, but instead, he decided not to change course and kept moving towards the official destination. New York City. This room was longer, and on top of that, the vessel allowed him to sail against storms, which only facilitated the spread of the fire. But what if Worms didn't turn the line, or because he just couldn't like the crew of Wilmy Goose Love, a transport vessel that went down 15 years later? Later that month, on January 13, 1945, 10,000 refugees boarded a ship bound for the open sea. This occurred before the end of World War II. The Allied powers were rapidly approaching Nazi Germany. German citizens who resided in their path were forced to flee. Escape. The administration made the decision to remove them. Germans residing in East Prussia, which was eventually partitioned between Poland and the Soviet Union, were among the first refugees on the list. Operation Hannibal of the Rye was the codename for this major evacuation. And even though the government tried to prevent panic, terrified people were ready to sneak. "I'm bored at any cost." Officially selling tickets for the trip didn't help much, as people tried to climb inside through even portholes. As a result, the liner, with a capacity of 2,000 people, departed carrying 5 times more power. People crowded every available surface and were almost literally heaped on top of one another, but that wasn't the only obstacle that awaited Wilhelm Ghost Love. The crew unintentionally turned on all navigation lights in the middle of the night. Of course, this was quickly fixed, but even so, a few seconds of shining in the dark were a fatal error. The Soviet submarine discovered the ship as 13 Captain Alexander mariners headed to issue the order or begin fire. 3 torpedoes were launched in the direction of Wilhelm Coast and Love Pretty, bringing everyone on board. The blasts were heard on the ship. The vessel couldn't be sent back to the beach because the damage was too severe and the German ship was severely laden. That's why it began to descend gradually. The worst thing is that it had enough lifeboats and life jackets to save all of the passengers if the ship capsized. There were 2,000 people, as intended, but not 5 times as much. That night, the ship was transformed into a real-life Hunger Games arena. All of the children were killed in the process, and the passengers who survived had to face another death threat. It is physically impossible to spend 10 minutes in the Baltic Sea without suffering frostbite. People opted to stay aboard the sinking ship out of desperation. When all of the lifeboats had been filled, there were still about 45 people on board when one of the German officials noticed there was no way out. When he got out, he raised his rifle in front of everyone else and murdered his wife and 2 boys, then pushed the barrel to his own head, only to learn there were no rounds remaining. The officer, clutching the remains of deceased family members, dragged them all down the snow-covered deck and into the cold sea. Because of that night, one of the many painful stories will be told. Only 1/10 of the passengers survived, about 1,000 people. When a salvage crew arrived at the scene, he couldn't even approach the remains of the ship because of all the dead bodies floating in the water. The post-disaster investigation revealed that there were also at least 200 stowaways. These illegal passengers were the main reason Morral Castle couldn't be moored to the nearest shore, but actually, there could be even more of them according to the official report. They couldn't afford a full-price ticket but could afford a small bribe and got on the ship thanks to the crew. The accident claimed the lives of 137 passengers and crew members. Nevertheless, some of the normal American stowaways were persuaded to board. At the time, there were also a large number of Cuban youngsters hiding in the breaks, and the country's economic situation had reached tragic proportions. Desperate parents were ready to do whatever it took to save their kids. They begged crews of American ships to take their sons and daughters with them to the U.S. It looks like those kids were the first victims to die in the Morral Council shipwreck since they were locked in the lowermost compartments. The captain, the storm, the fire, the inexperienced sailors, and the charge into hundreds of random passengers brought Morral Castle to the point where it had zero chance of staying afloat. But is it just a chain of coincidences? This is George Rogers, chief radio operator at Morral Castle. For some unknown reason, he didn't send a distress call immediately after the fire started and waited 40 minutes to do that. This delay was the final detail that determined the fate of the line. Rogers was also the final one to see Captain Robert Wilmette alive. Could it be that he had been poisoned rather than purchased something? During the Great Depression, Rogers had added an ingredient to Rodney's meals that caused him to become beat. In our country, this individual had been found guilty of nearly all offenses. Listen to the threats of terrorism and murder attempts. Even more intriguing is the fact that Rogers didn't join the crew by accident. Despite his dubious past, the government chose him to be the ship's radio chief operator. Rogers was not even someone to interrogate, yet he managed to escape there with a few other survivors. Afterward, if the government had really put such a madman on board on purpose, the rest of the surviving sailors also got off. Very likely, they were taken into custody for questioning and then released straight away. If you check the photo showing them that very day, you'll see them smiling. Why does it look like they were offered a good deal and told to keep their mouths shut instead of being punished for negligence? What is the big secret they were hiding? The investigators proved that illegal passengers were the least shocking cargo on Morro Castle deck plans found after the tragedy. Field a compartment for gunpowder transportation, but why would a cruise ship carry stuff like, as the thing is, President Roosevelt, who was in power at the time, was a staunch supporter of the Cuban military coup, and even though the US was officially neutral behind the scenes, he often meddled in different colors? Go processes in South America, for example, he secretly supplied weapons. An unremarkable tour shipped Morro Castle was just that by that day. A couple of articles exposing the president's scheme had already appeared in the press. Perhaps the government just found it much easier to sink the liner together with all the incriminating evidence on board than deal with an international scandal. Later radio operator George Rogers was a perfect choice for making this appalling play and work after the shipwreck. Rogers only kept adding to his criminal record. When arrested for another offense he committed, the man once casual. We mentioned to the police that he knew what exact compartment the fire had started on Morro Castle, something that even forensic experts couldn't tell for sure. As for now, Rogers' direct involvement in the Morro Castle disaster has not been proven, but one thing is certain, even the most luxurious said mean always be a plain cover-up for something formidable, and if you think such shipwrecks have become a thing of the past in our modern progressive world, don't jump to conclusions. This fabulous cruise ship named Costa Concordia sank not so long ago. In 26, 33 people died. Tragedy, and at least 65 people were hurt. The passenger ferry Excellent collided with a cargo pier at the port of Barcelona 6 years later in 20 teams. This resulted in a fire that burned for hours before being ultimately put out by special services only a year later. They were in the harbor when a nearly identical disaster occurred, except this time it was a much larger vessel that lost control and smashed into the dock. Now tell me, will you think twice before making a cruise reservation?